I want to remind you of the Table of Nations by Xerxes, depicting every nation he saw, from the Persians, the Medians, Elamite, Parthian, Aryan, Bactrian, Sogdian, Choresmian, Zarangian, and much more. But the interesting part is how he portrays the Ethiopian and the Egyptian. They look almost identical, except the Egyptian is wearing a helmet hiding his head. But you'll notice that all of these people are carrying the military weapon. There's so much detail in here that should tell us about what these people were doing during their time. But I was not the only person to notice this. In the late 1700s and the early 1800s, an author named Bodwick T. Edwards, or Thomas Edward, realized these similarities and wrote them down. And in one part, he says, Herodotus also assures us that Xerxes had Occidental Ethiopians and Libyans in his army when he invaded Greece. The former had woolly hair and anointed their bodies before going into action, and the latter have been concluded to be the Negro Ethiopians, described so accurately by Diodorus and placed by him in the heart of Africa, as well as on the borders of the Nile. The sweeping expedition of the Ptolemies Evergates, who is known by the record of his triumphal monument at Adulis, to have subdued nations southward of the source of the Nile, and others as far westward as the modern kingdom of Kula, undoubtedly compelled many Ethiopian tribes or families inherited the superstition and customs which their ancestors had adopted from the Egyptian immigrants to retire still more westward from the first alarm of his approach, the fear of a second invasion or the apprehension of being despoiled of half their possessions. As he records, some of the nations whom he subdued to have been the figures in the temple of Kalabsha convinced Burchard that the Egyptians had carried their arms farther into the interior than it had been before concluded. This type of book, and I've shown you a lot of the fact that people who were British in the past, they truly believed without a doubt in their mind that the ancient Egyptians were like the Libyans and the Ethiopians, of which they thought the natives were of African descent. And like I said before, the tradition, the history of the Berbers. A lot of people see the Arabs in Morocco and all these other places and think that they all are the same thing. But even the Moroccans believe that they were darker in their history. And to find books like this that just cement that type of belief and also fights this idea that it was Afrocentrists who made it up, but instead were reviving a long known history that had been collapsed by people with an agenda. I mean, listen to this. The traditions of immigration, not of the whole population, but of particular families, so current in Ashanti and the neighboring nations, the numerous exceptions to the Negro continents, and the striking similitude of most of their more extraordinary superstitions, laws, and customs to those of the ancient Egyptians, persuade me that most of the higher classes are descended from the Eastern Ethiopians who have been improved by the intercourse with the Egyptian immigrants and colonists. The connection and intercourse of Egypt and Ethiopia seem naturally to have existed from the foundation of these kingdoms. The Greek writers agree that the Ethiopians frequently bursting into Egypt with their vast armies by the same route to so fatal to the troops of Cambyses, subdued and occupied it for ages. The Ethiopic dynasties are recorded in the Egyptian chronicles, an Ethiopian had been elevated to the throne of Egypt long before the reign of Sesostris, a king of Ethiopia celebrated for his moderation and his prudence, was invited to expel this and succeed the tyrant Amosis. Another seized the throne which the Egyptians had before proffered, or according to his countrymen, and after expiating the usurpation by region of 50 years, distinguished by wisdom and humanity, by the abolition of death and superstitions, of useful public labor as punishment, perfected his glory by voluntary retiring to his native country. The commerce between Egypt and Ethiopia was so ancient as the wars, and even in the times of Herodotus and Strabo, the two people were indiscriminately blended in Elephantine and its neighborhood, which they had inhabited in common. The former asserts the tradition attributed an Ethiopian origin to Elephantine and Thebes. But mere intercourse, however intimate, does not seem sufficient to account for the striking coincidence of superstitions and customs, which I shall submit. They are only to be explained by the immigrations from Egypt to Ethiopia recorded in the ancient authors. I will not dwell on the expedition of Sestros, who is considered to have subdued the whole of Abyssinia and the kingdom of Adel, but rest principally on the fact related by Herodotus and confirmed by Diodorus. This person here is repeating my interpretation and really a lot of other black theory interpretations of ancient Egypt say that not only can you prove that they're related genetically, but you can prove that they're related in culture and even beliefs. But it's even bigger than this because this book was written so early that this is the earliest times that I think black people were still in slavery when this book was written. There is no way that this person had a bias towards black Africans. Nothing should have told him this. Instead, he just read a book and he spent time with the Ashanti in such a serious way that he had to come to a conclusion that made sense. I think him and who they call the father of Egyptology, I think they died in the same decade. That's how old this is. My favorite part about this is that no one ever brings these people up. No one ever brings up the Arabs who, in their numbers, said that the ancient Egyptians were Sudan. No one ever brings up these British guys who, in their numbers, say the culture and even the race of the people, in their eyes, they made this up. This guy did not get this from the Asante that he spent time with. He did not get this from any black activists. I mean, there wouldn't have been any at the time, really. He made this up. He looked at the information and said, I cannot conclude that it's any other way. The funny part is he even mentions the symbols that are adinkra at an early time. He mentions them and he says that these symbols to me look like hieroglyphics and that he wishes he had spent some time observing them so that he could properly connect them together. He even says that the architecture of the Ashanti is similar to that of the Egyptians and Ethiopians. It is funny. It is hilarious to me that the ancient Egyptians and the Ethiopians and Sudanese have to debate their way out of who we really are. We have to debate and show people and prove to people that we are black and that the ancient Egyptians were black, as if people are blind, as if people don't have time to sit and look at, just go. And this is the worst part. I uploaded a video about this. It's so easy to just look it up. And on first sight, I've changed people's minds. I've had black people argue with me about the Egyptians. And when I showed them a single statue, they're like, wait a minute. Neither are we sure that the type of curious architecture discovered in the Ashanti, the ornaments of which are evidently of Egyptian character, does not exist on a larger scale in some Ethiopic ruins in the interior. Ibn al-Ardi asserted in the 13th century that there were old and ancient cities in the further part of Africa, and Ensidil was informed in his mission that there were many ancient ruins in Eskar. Before I finish reading, I have to explain straight away. Ibn al-Wardi, the one that he explains, is the one that I showed you those maps of. The same guy that had those maps commissioned, at where he puts Africa and he puts the other ones. He's the same guy who says, he asserts this, that Ethiopia going further south, there's other buildings. Now, this is interesting because he then further says other Greeks say there were civilizations going further down. And remember, the maps that I showed you, they cut off at Ethiopia. They cut off at about the Abyssinian because they had never gone any further than that by that time. And then after that, the whole Africa was mapped, but this is before. Except for some very adventurous historians and adventurers. And that's why it says, if we continue, said to be south of Afno and SSW of Borno, Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus both agree in distinguishing Ethiopians in some degree civilized from others who were savages, speaking of the former as having been of themselves a little advanced and afterwards perfected in laws and manners by the deserts and colonists from Egypt. And again, I have to assert this. I said this before. A lot of people, right, the way they championed stereotypes about black Africans, and you can see even the ancient Greeks knew this. The way they champion stereotypes is they grab tribes in Africa which still stick to a much older regime, which usually it wasn't because they started that way. We've seen it through linguistics of the Bantu people that almost every culture has a word for cotton, or a word for fiber, or a word for iron, or a word for rubber, or a word for palm oil. It's just some get destabilized. And what do you do when you get destabilized? You go back to a natural way of living. And we know through the Bantu migration, because these are the people that he's talking about, that these people came, including the Zulus, by the way. We talk about the Zulus and everybody, even people who didn't wear cotton cloths. And before they went down to these places during the Bantu migration, which is about 3000 BC, they were wearing clothes of cotton. But a lot of these places, they fight wars, they lose, they migrate, they run away, and they are limited in resources, and they do the best they can. Some were luckier than others. That's why you find some people who have golden statues and they have big buildings. But you if you check each Bantu tribe, they have the same underlying core history. And his assertion here, which I think it's a bit opposite, is that it must be that the Egyptians or something must have been, these people must have been leaked Egyptians or escaped Egyptians or something. Whereas I think that the culture of the ancient Egyptians is just the same. The core culture, the bottom culture, where, again, I stated some people did better than others, and the Egyptians are the some who did the best than others, but their core is the same. Their bottom is the same. Being a keen observer, he noticed the writings of Ethiopian writing on their dresses and the Asante dresses that also have patterns. And he noticed the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and he makes a connection. And he says, if we read the second last sentence, he says, although these Ethiopic characters are always intermixed in the interblatures, yet in the cornices, I have frequently observed them ranged individually. I regret exceedingly that the idea of there being hieroglyphics did not strike me when in Kumasi, nor did it occur to me until reading Mr. Salt's travels in Abyssinia for the first time. I recognized them in his engravings of the Ethiopic characters found at Aksum and Iyiha. He then goes on to say, these hieroglyphics assume a much more regular appearance in the Ashanti buildings, from the greater facility of working men them in plaster, those discovered by Mr. Salt being engraved in stone, of which the Ashanti declare they have none but the iron stone on which their capital is built. The difference, the different nature of the new country is one of the circumstances detailed by miners as conspiring to effect diversity between colonies and the mother country, and the want of stone must have compelled in some degree the disuse of the Ethiopic characters amongst the Ashantis, as it precludes the most natural application of them to tombs as at Exum and Yeha. I imagine too that the Ashanti, having merely preserved them as architectural ornaments, naturally construct them with a precision and delicacy which injures the resemblance, although in some of the houses of the chiefs they were so rude and disjointed as to excite my surprise that such uncouth figures could be associated as ornaments with the elegant patterns of the base. For I think two of those figured in the plate may pretend to the character the rudest cornices, which in my ignorance I dispense too much to draw. The Ethiopian symbols on their books and on their dresses and on their walls did not go over the heads of these British, and their similarities to the writings in the books, in the clothing, and on the walls of the Asante did not go over their head either, and they're not going to go over mine. And their final connection, their base connection with other Bantu and Egyptian and North African, Libyan cultures will not go over my head. There's an obvious connection, and someone as far back as the 1700s could see it.